I want to talk about kind of a weird phenomenon for a minute. Maybe this has happened to you before, but has anyone ever come up to you and said, God told me? Or have you been that person, right? Can you throw that slide up there for me? Wait for it. There it is. God told me. Have you ever experienced this before? I was in a restaurant here not long ago, and it was not the first time this had happened, but it was a really special moment for me that someone came up, put their hand on my shoulder, I had no idea who they were, and they said, God told me, and then they added this line, to tell you. You ever had anybody do this before? Now, I'm going to be honest with you just for a second. There are moments when this happens, I'm like, well, why didn't God tell me? Well, hold on a second. Lord, here I am. Do you not hear me as well? You taught them to come over and tell me. And it was actually something really I just desperately needed to hear. It was a word of comfort in a time. They had no idea who I was and what was going through. And I know that was a Holy Spirit moment. But there's also some moments where, and this I think gets used the wrong way, and this might be a reason, especially if you're not a Jesus follower, what I'm about to add to this may be a reason why you're cynical about this statement, right? Now, let me just say before I read this last piece, I believe that God speaks to us. I believe that God wants to speak to us every single day. He wants you desperately to hear him. But maybe, just maybe, somewhere along the way, you became cynical because someone came up to you one day, whether they meant it or not, maybe they were wearing a microphone, and they said, God told me to tell you to give me, right? To give me. Now, a funny example of this, and I'll let you fill in the blanks with the harder ones, but a funny example for this to me, I find this, the world of Christian dating is really weird right now. I had a young person in our church who's in our college ministry who came up and said, I had someone ask me out on a date, and the opening line was, God told me I'm going to marry you. I was like, that was the pickup line? Are you kidding me? So sometimes this is a little weird. Like when we hear these things, God told me, automatically our brains go into, did he really? And so maybe, and what I'm about to say over these next few minutes, you're already like crossing your arms and you're like, sure, does God really speak today? But I believe in my heart that he does. I truly believe in my heart that he does, and he wants to speak to you about something that I think is really, really important. So can you flip to the next slide for me for a minute? Here's the thing. Can you hear from God? And not just hear from God, can it be practical, right? Can God practically speak to you? Can he speak to you specifically and practically and definitively, right? Can you hear from him personally? Can you hear from him clearly? And my agenda today is that maybe to start a conversation. I don't think there's any way for me to finish this entire can of worms, but to start a conversation in you where you might distinctly and intentionally try to listen for what God has to say to you. Because again, if we really believe what we say we believe, Jesus followers, then we know we have a Heavenly Father that loves us and cares for us and has a best for us. And I think it's our job, not just for us personally, like I know there's some stuff in there that will make our lives better, but like this is not a make your life better thing. This is the kingdom is at work in our community thing. And I think it's our role as Jesus followers to listen to what God has to say and then do it. Now, to do all of this, I want to speak through a very specific lens, and it's kind of maybe perhaps a polarizing character or not, from the Old Testament. I'm an Old Testament nerd, for those of you that might know me, and I want to talk about Moses. Now, give you some context for Moses, especially if you haven't heard this story before, and I'll do this super quick. Maybe when you think of Moses, you already have an image in your brain, but I just want to eliminate that for a second and think, okay? So Moses shows up in history. We know that he wrote the first five, mostly wrote the first five books of our Bible. So this is called the Torah, the first five books, mostly written by Moses. And Genesis and Exodus are the first two books that you're going to find in your Bible. He wrote both of those. And Exodus is really he's the main character, okay? Now, this is important to know because in this story that I'm going to tell you today, he's writing it from a first-person account. So he's talking about what his experience was when he listened from God. But if you don't know Moses, you might not understand what he's trying to say. So just a little bit of background. He shows up in history as someone who is an enslaved minority. The group of Israelites at that time had been enslaved by Pharaoh. They're in Egypt. It was bad. There's a long, cool story in the Old Testament that you should read that gets them to that point. In fact, the first opening lines of Exodus are, a Pharaoh arose who didn't know Joseph, which was the beginning of all of their people coming to Israel to Egypt in the first place. And when they got there, they were like in this really cool relationship with Pharaoh, but the next thing they knew, they were enslaved. So Moses is born into this world where his family are slaves. Right? He's born as an enslaved minority. Now, he's adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, which is kind of a cool story as well. There was this horrible moment where Pharaoh decided he wanted to cut back on the population of Israelites in Egypt, and he tries to kill lots of them. His mother puts him in a basket, sails him down a river. Pharaoh's daughter finds him. It's a neat story, okay? So he's adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, which means he's been raised as Egyptian royalty. Now, born as an enslaved minority, raised as Egyptian royalty. He's got his foot in two worlds. And he's found himself in a place where he knows who he is and where he's come from, but at the same time, he kind of has some allegiances, and he's got people that know him, and he feels torn between two families. And this is Moses' brain, okay? This is his world. Now, at the same time, he finds himself torn between these two worlds, but also defensive of both of them. And so he's out in the community one day, and he sees an Egyptian slave driver who is being very horrible to another Israelite. And so he ends up killing he murders the Egyptian slave master. So Moses becomes a murderer. It's the beginning of his story. Now, if you grew up in my parents' generation or mine, I remember watching this movie a lot when I was a kid. When you think of Moses, when I mention his name, this is what you see. Okay, Charlton Heston from 10 Commandments, right? Let my people go, right? I remember watching this every Easter when I was a kid. It was on, I don't know why it was on Easter, but every Easter we watched it on TV. Now, if you're a millennial like me, perhaps your picture of Moses looks more like this guy, this is Prince of Egypt. Have you ever seen that movie before? I showed it at a vacation Bible school once when I was a young pastor, scared a bunch of kids, had to write letters to parents. It was not the best idea. But the truth is Moses, okay, Charlton Heston gives us a pretty good picture, and Prince of Egypt maybe, but the truth is Moses is actually a whole lot more like this guy. And if you don't know who this is, Richard Kimball from The Fugitive, he was on the lam, right? He was running. So Moses flees from Egypt out into the desert, and he's trying to forget who he was. He's trying to forget where he came from, and he's just trying to hide. And that is the context for the story. That is the context for the story that I want to share with you now. Again, this starts in Exodus chapter 3, and we're going to pick up with Moses after he's already been married. So weird story. He runs into a town. He's sitting in a well. There's this group of robbers who are being mean to a group of girls. He rescues them and runs off the robbers, impresses their dad. So their dad just gives him one of his daughters, like, look the ethics that up sometime, okay? But he gets married to one of these daughters, and that's where he's living. He's living in Midian as the son-in-law of Jethro, and he's tending his flock. So here's how it goes in Exodus chapter 3, verse 1. Now Moses was tending the flocks of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he continues like this. He led the flock to the far side of the wilderness, came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Now, Horeb is Mount Sinai. He didn't know this, okay? Remember, Moses is writing this story. He experienced everything he's about to experience. And so at the time, this place is called Horeb. And so he finds himself leading the flock over there, doesn't know it's the mountain of God, doesn't know about the thunder and the lightning and the fire and the voice of God, any of that. He's just wandering around in his aimless, stuck between two worlds life. And so he leads this flock over to Horeb. And then the story continues like this. There, I love this. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. You know this story if you grew up in Sunday school, right? There's this burning bush, and Moses, he's tending the flock, and there's sheep, and then he sees this thing, right? It's kind of curious. Moses saw that the bush was on fire, but it did not burn up. Now, this is interesting, right? Not only the fact that there's a bush that's on fire and it's not burning up, but that this is the way Moses remembers this. Now, in the Old Testament, fire has a couple of different things that it could mean. So most of the time, fire in the Old Testament can either mean judgment or refinement, right? It's a theme that carries through the entire Old Testament. But because this bush is not burned up, automatically when we're reading this story, we know that this is a story about refinement. So now, as someone who's in this story, we're listening to this story, we're thinking about this, what exactly is God trying to refine in Moses, right? This guy doesn't know who his purpose is. He's a guy who doesn't know what the next step's supposed to be. He's a guy that's running between two worlds. He's a guy that's on the lam. He's just trying to forget who he was, maybe. He has a heritage that he's not super proud of. God is about to refine him in something, but the specifics of this is beautiful, and I think that's the message for us. So the story continues like this. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why this bush is not burned. So again, tending the flock, sees this, that's curious, and he has a curious moment. And he says, I'll turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not consumed. Now listen to this next verse. This is where it kicks, okay? Listen to this. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see. Did you catch it? Did you catch it? This is why I'm a nerd. Okay, this is the thing that I love this much. Okay, I switched to the ESV. I'm normally an NIV guy, but I switched to the NSV for this translation because this phrase, turn aside to see, is actually repeated. It's the exact same Hebrew in both sentences. So Moses, experiencing this, writes down this phrase, turn aside to see. I decided to turn aside to see, and then the Lord saw that I turned aside to see. Now, in our language, in English, okay, this is the Hope City early service. Y'all can take a Hebrew lesson, right? Okay, deep breaths, okay? Here we go, deep breaths. In Hebrew, it's just two phrases. And I'm not even going to try to explain how to read the top thing, but the best way to pronounce both of these root words is sur ra'ah. Now, sur just means to turn away from, and ra'ah means to give attention to. And so Moses said, in a curious moment, oh, look, there's a burning bush. I will turn aside to see what this is. And then, when the Lord saw that Moses had turned aside to see, when he had sur ra'ad, listen to what happens in the story. Next phrase, right here. When God saw that he had turned aside to see, what happened? God called to him out of the bush. Now look, this might seem like kind of a strange semantics thing, okay? But there's something going on in this verse that I do not want you to miss. Because Moses is telling his own story, okay? And if Moses wanted to just write however it went together, like I saw a bush, I walked over, then God started to speak to me, he would have done that. But instead, Moses said, I decided to turn aside and look, and then the Lord saw that I had turned aside to look, and then he spoke to me. Moses had discovered something, I think, about the way God likes to speak to us, likes to speak to you. And I just want to wrestle with it for just a minute, okay? Now, there's a couple of questions I hope you're asking yourself by this point. Can you throw that first question up there for me? It's this. Do you have space and margin to hear from God? I have 4 children. My oldest is 16, soon to be 17. He'll be a junior in high school this year, which is the most terrifying thing. And my youngest is 7, and we call her the Wolverine, okay? I have this, stoic 16, almost 17-year-old kid who's just plays soccer and hides in his room, and a 7-year-old who I don't even know where to start, okay? And everything in between. I have 3 girls and 1 boy. We are busy, right? We are a big family, so there's lots of things going on. And so when I hear the word space and margin, I usually chuckle just like you did, right? I do. It's like, are you kidding me? Have you seen my schedule? It's now summer. Now we got to run the kids all the places, and there's a sleepover every day. And, the Holderness family had that video not long ago called May-cember, and I just related to that on such a molecular level, like banquets every night and trying to get the kids every place. Space and margin sounds really hard, doesn't it? And I'm not going to sit up here and sugarcoat it for you. I could stay and say, why don't you have space and margin? The truth is we've all done it to ourselves. And no matter what stage of life you find yourselves in, kids, no kids, college, empty nester, all the things in between, you don't have a lot of space and margin in your calendar. I know, because we're all human. But the interesting thing to me is, in this story, it wasn't until Moses went from giving his attention over here and paying attention to what was happening with the sheep and came over here to look at the burning bush. It wasn't until he turned aside, right? It wasn't until he took a moment to listen, to make space, that God could hear him, that he could hear God. So I don't want to be harsh, okay? Only people who love you say hard things. But I often find myself when people come to my office and they're sharing I just desperately hear from God and God's not speaking to me and I don't know why. And I'm like, well, when was the last time you sat down and prayed? Well, I get up in the morning and I just say a few things in the shower and then, I'm like, okay, well, when was the last time you set out 20 minutes of your day and just sat and listened for God? Well, I don't know. That sounds really hard. Yeah, it does, doesn't it? And look, I'm not trying to be a jerk. I really love you all, and I love this church, and I would love for John to invite me back one day. But the truth is, we want to blame God for not talking to us when oftentimes he's trying to scream at us, but our calendars are in the way. It happens. It happens in my life. If I don't guard my boundaries around my morning and evening prayer time, they won't happen. They won't. And if you find yourself in a season of time where you're I really want to hear from God, the first question you need to ask is, do you actually have the space and margin to listen? Now the other one, and this is the one that cut me to the quick, okay? The other question I want to ask you is this, question number 2. Do you need to turn away from something? Now, right out of the gate, you might think that this means like an addiction or a bad habit. And in a lot of ways it might, okay? The truth is, when we talk about this in Celebrate Recovery and other ministries that we talk with addicts, you have something it's consuming your body, but it's also consuming your soul. And it's distancing you. It's become the Lord and the God in your life, and you need to lay that down. And that could be anything. Look, it could be a substance. It could be, you fill in the blank with all of the things, okay? I don't have to give you a laundry list. But many of us find ourselves in a place we can't hear from God because there's something else we're listening to that's louder. And look, you don't have to think very hard to know what that is, do you? You don't need a person with a microphone to stand up here and make a list because you already know what that is. And so there's this all-consuming idol that exists in your life, and you need to lay it down or you can't hear from God. Or God could be saying, lay that down so I can tell you something else. And that's the step. You know it's the step, you just haven't done it yet. It could be that. But the other thing that's just as likely, and this is where I have to be a little bit more vulnerable than I like being sometimes. It could be that God is speaking to you, but he's not giving you the answer you want to hear. This happens to me because I have my own preferences, right? I know I'm getting deep water now. They're like, get this guy off the stage. I know, I'm meddling. I know, but I love you. And look, this is hard. It's the truth. We got to talk about it for a second. I know when I was wrestling with the decision to come and be the pastor at Church Tuscaloosa, I knew all this stuff, okay? I knew the reputation stuff. I knew there were like 30 people there. I knew that it had an up and down history, like all the things, okay? I knew all that. The thing I wasn't wrestling with wasn't that, okay? That wasn't as big a deal. But when I talked to them, at the time I was serving in a pretty prominent large church in Cincinnati area. I was in line for the throne, as we said, like I was going to be the guy one day. I had a staff. I went home at 5 o'clock every day, came back in the office at 8 and didn't have anything in between. Like I had a cushy, comfortable role at my previous church. My kids were, happy. We had a house not far from my mom, all of those things. And so when I get the call and offered the opportunity to come to Tuscaloosa, I was like, why the heck would I want to do that? Like, that's just a terrible idea. What a horrible idea. Like, it's the pandemic and, why would we want to move and all the things. And it was my wife. She couldn't come with me today. She's actually serving at TCAT this morning. But my wife came up and she didn't say we had to go to Tuscaloosa. But what she said rocked me to my core. And I'm not making this up. I can remember this conversation. We were sitting in our living room. I had just got off the phone with one of the elders over there. And I was like, look, this is so kind, but I just don't think this is a thing. And I started rattling off all of my preferences. And she said, well, why don't you want to go? I said, well, what are you telling me you want to go? She said, that's not what I'm saying. Like, if God told you to go, would you go? And I sat back on our couch for a minute. I was like, well, of course he would if he told me to go. But he's not telling me to go because here's all these other things. She said, no, that's not what I'm saying. If God clearly spoke to you and said, this is where you're supposed to go, if it didn't match your preferences and match up with your way, would you go? And I just wanted to get mad at my wife for a minute, to be really, truly honest. But she was telling the truth. And I'm not saying that she was super excited to move down here either. But fast forward to now, and I've never been happier in my life. I've never been happy. My kids are happy. My wife is happy. We love our community. We love Tuscaloosa. And I would have missed that. I would have missed that if I'd leaned into what I wanted God's answer in my life to be. Now, look, that was a pretty innocuous example. There are very deep-rooted, trauma-filled things that you are praying about in your life where you want something very specific to happen. And I just want to sit with you for a minute and own that that's the case. There's a family under my care at TCAT that have been struggling with infertility for months and months and months and months and months and months. And it is hard and it hurts. No matter how hard you pray for something, you're not quite getting the answer that you're looking for. There was someone else I was sitting with where they were struggling through some really deep-rooted things they were praying about, and they just felt like they were knocking on heaven as hard as they could, and they just couldn't hear anything back. So I get that. I want to own all that with you. I'm not sugarcoating what I'm saying, and I'm not living in some sort of spiritual bubble that makes you think like, oh, he's just in, he gets to hear from God all the time. This ain't that. But as we push all that stuff, kind of sit it on the table with us for a minute and think in the middle. How often do our preferences get in the way of our answered prayers? How often would God like to lean into your life and answer your prayers in a very specific way, but it's not the way you were looking for? And it's not quite the pathway that you had in mind, or it's not quite the answer you were looking for. Now, God is a gracious and loving God. And the thing is, I've seen him do this. He's done it in my own life, where he's like, well, this is the plan I have for you. And I love you, and I'm not going to do harm to you, but I'm just going to sit and wait. How long did Moses stand over there staring at the sheep? He made it sound like it was a pretty quick thing that he turned aside to see the bush. But how long did he sit there staring at it before he walked over? I just think that sometimes in our lives, if we're really honest, God is screaming his answer to us. He's screaming his call to you. He's already planned out what he wants you to do and how he wants you to do it. It just doesn't align with your preferences. And sometimes this is just what it looks like to follow Jesus, because being a Jesus follower meant, like he even told his disciples, he didn't sugarcoat anything. Just pick up your cross and follow me, right? This is where I'm going. Now there's awesomeness on the other side of this path, but it's not going to go the way you think it's going to go. We even hear in the Gospels, there was a moment where the disciples looked at Jesus, and there were a bunch of people that turned away, and Jesus turned around and said, do you want to leave me too? Does anybody remember what the response was? To whom shall I go? Where else would I go, Jesus? You've already shown me how life really works. Well, I already know that you have eternity in your hands. I already know that you're God's son. Where else would I go? And so as we lean into this, hearing from God, what I'm hoping is I'm just starting our conversation, okay? Where are the places in your life where you can create margin? And where are the places in your life where your preferences are in the way of God's answer for you? Because the other thing that I've learned, and I'm not trying to like twist the knife, okay, I swear I'm not. A lot of times when God's trying to speak to me, it's not just about me. That there are other lives that hang in the balance. My kids, my wife, my family, people in the community. What if God's calling you and equipping you to lead a ministry right here at Hope City? And you're the only one. That he equipped you and called you and prepared you for that thing. And as you wrestle and say, that's not my preference and that's not my way, there are people waiting to be met and ministered to through that work that only you could have done. So listen to this story one more time. Exodus chapter 3 says this. Flip over the next slide for me. Wait for it. There. I forgot. This is important. Okay, really quick. Sorry, I got ahead of my notes. I was too excited. Let's just take the religion stuff off of our heads for a minute, okay? And then I'm done. I'm sorry. This is it. So this whole idea, turn away from and to give attention to, right? If you just take Jesus out of the equation for a minute, which I know we're in church and that's a bad thing. I'm not heretical, I promise, okay? But if you're cynical about all of this, if you're like cynical about God and cynical about Jesus and all the things, to turn away from and to give attention to, okay? Scientists have recently discovered that this process is something we as human beings go through every day. And do you know what this leads to? This is proven science. Enlightenment and revelation and inspiration. That your brain is actually wired. That when you turn away from and give attention to something, you are able to give it attention that leads to revelation and understanding. And guess what? Moses told you that a couple thousand years ago. So God has hardwired you to hear from him this way. And this is the process by which we should decide to hear. Now, one more time for the scripture, and then this is it, okay? One more. I did get ahead of my notes. It's okay. This is what happens when I don't bring paper up here with me. Just go to that last one where it's Exodus chapter 3. Did I not put it up there? Oh, okay, cool. Well, there, when the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, then he spoke to him through the bush. What are you waiting for to hear from God?